General, it's great to see you today.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks for the opportunity.
So, General, there's been a lot going on recently, and I was really curious how you were interpreting the events. As you saw, recently Ukraine was forced out of Kursk, Russia, almost totally. They're still there in parts, but it seems that they've lost a lot of what they held for already months. A lot are saying, though, the real reason that happened was simply that the US had cut off intelligence at the same time that it cut off weapon supplies to Ukraine. What do you make of that? Is that true? And does that seem like what the US has done historically to put pressure on its allies is to cut off the intelligence that it's sharing while they're in a hot war?
Well, if they're allies and you want to help them, you don't cut off aid, you don't cut off intelligence. You can apply pressure in other ways, but to do something that results in the death of Ukrainian, in this case, Ukrainian soldiers, you have to wonder, well, how does this advance America's strategic interests? I mean, how does this help us? Ukraine was in there in Kursk since last August. One of the most, I think, effective strategic moves made by the Ukrainian side of the war. It accomplished a lot in terms of changing the narrative of Russian invincibility. It created strategic problems for the Russian side. And the Russians had tried for months to eliminate this bridgehead, but they never could. And then all of a sudden, at about the same time that the U.S. administration cuts off intelligence, cuts off aid, the Russians are able to accomplish what they had not been able to do for the previous 6, almost 7 months. I can't prove that there was a direct causal relationship, but it's certainly, unfortunately, based on what the administration has been doing and saying the last several weeks, it seems entirely plausible that that's what caused it. As you know, having to withdraw under pressure is always a very, very difficult, challenging situation. It's even more challenging when you lose access to intelligence that you have been using before.
So, going ahead, if you were in the field as a Ukrainian officer and you realize that one day whatever intelligence you're receiving can just be turned off, how do you plan for that? What plan Bs can you develop?
Well, of course, the Ukrainians are going to do what they've always done, which is adapt, come up with innovative solutions to try and fill in that gap from what they've lost. I suspect there are some European countries that are going to try to replace that as well to provide some sort of assistance. But, whenever the intelligence business is never based on one thing. It's multi-source where you fuse together signals intelligence, imagery intelligence, human intelligence, and various other ints, and you try to put together the picture of what's happening in front of you or what you think is happening. And so when one of those um, components is severely degraded or disappears, you have to increase it using other things. So I would imagine that Ukrainians will look for ways to increase imagery using drones to try and fill that gap, but it will be difficult to replace in toto the loss to what U.S. satellites were providing them.
Now, looking ahead, some have said that the White House currently is considering recognizing illegally annexed, illegally occupied Crimea as part of Russia. And we've discussed Crimea before, but could you please explain why you think that would be a disaster and why Crimea, from a military perspective, is so incredibly important to Ukraine's future?
Well, I have believed from the beginning that Crimea was the decisive terrain of the war, that whoever held Crimea, when all was said and done, would be able to say that they had accomplished their mission. Um, for Ukraine, if Russia controls Crimea, it has total control of it, then the Russians will forever be able to sortie out and disrupt shipping in the Western Black Sea, threaten all of Ukraine's remaining Black Sea ports, and make it very difficult for the Ukrainians to protect their cities and their coastline from the Russian Navy, if assuming that the Black Sea Fleet does in fact somehow return. Um, so from an economic standpoint, as well as a security standpoint, Crimea was always going to be very important for Ukraine. For the Russians, of course, the whole reason that they did what they did back in 2014 was because they were worried that they might lose Crimea as a result of Maidan and what was happening then, because they needed it to be able to continue to support their ally Syria, to continue to be able to dominate the Black Sea. So it's the reason Catherine took it back at the end of the 18th century. It was such an important geographical platform, if you will, for projecting power. The fact that this is being considered by the United States as some sort of a, yet again, another carrot in this negotiating process that seems to be completely one-sided, that the U.S. would even consider doing that. That's at the top of the wish list for Vladimir Putin. And of course, what it also does, it undermines all of the efforts by many nations, including our own, at enforcing respect for sovereignty. I mean, the Russians had agreed multiple times that Crimea was Ukrainian sovereign territory. And now the United States is potentially throwing that into the trash can. And of course, the Chinese will take note of that as well, that the U.S. is not really serious about sovereignty or freedom of navigation and these kind of things. So I think this shows me that the only thing that matters to the administration is wanting to be able to claim that they finally got a deal, regardless of the moral principles involved.
So, what does that mean, though, in the long term for the U.S.? The fact that it seems that we are dropping it on Ukraine. We're not helping them, even though they were counting on us. And our European allies now are watching this all transpire. The Taiwanese are watching this all transpire, and our allies in other parts of the world. How do you think this is going to play out for America in the long run? And also, what impact does this have on us back in America?
Yeah, I see zero positive outcomes for the United States as a result of this. Not only does it look like we have completely sided with the Russians, our European allies and partners with whom we have hundreds of billions of dollars of shared economic interests, not to mention our alliance security obligations, but our economic interests. These are going to be questioned, and Europeans are already. I hear it every day from journalists and academics and military and politicians from multiple European countries questioning American commitment. And then our Turkish ally. Turkey, of course, has been a member of NATO since 1952. They have sovereignty over the Straits, the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, at the south end of the Black Sea. Turkey is not obligated by any agreement between the United States and Russia. They have their interests there. And from the very beginning, President Erdogan has said that they do not recognize Russian claims to Crimea. So a lot of people are involved. This is not just a U.S.-Russia decision. So I think what we're going to find out, that a lot of the people on the president's negotiating team are clueless about geography. They're clueless about Europe. They don't understand our strategic interests in the region, and that most European countries are not going to be willing to just accept whatever the Kremlin and the White House think they will have agreed to. And obviously, Ukraine is not going to accept it.
Well, you're absolutely right. As you know, one of the top negotiators for the U.S. at this point is a billionaire friend of Donald Trump's, who's a real estate developer, who, as far as I know, has never worked in either geopolitics or in the military or intelligence or any related field whatsoever. But looking ahead, knowing European history well and the history of war in Europe very well, how do you think this will play out in the long run? If we finally do have some sort of a forced peace in Ukraine, Russia's ambitions to take all of Ukraine have not by any means evaporated. Part of Ukraine is recognized as Russian by the United States. Its allies in Europe do not recognize that territory as being Russian, but rather simply occupied. How is this going to work out in the long run?
I think one of the ways it's going to work out in the long run is that the United States is going to lose so much influence in Europe. Already, nations are starting to reconsider their purchases, planned purchases of American equipment. We've seen that from Canada, from Portugal. Other countries are starting to question, here in Germany, are starting to question whether or not they want to go with the F-35. not because they don't love the F-35. It's the best aircraft on the planet, but it's because they're uncertain about America's reliability. Could the United States government do things that would render these very expensive aircraft or other weapon systems as to make them either degrade them or to make them unusable because of the U.S. control of some of the networks. There's a lot of mythology out there, but the bottom line is confidence in the United States is under pressure. And then, of course, um, we have enormous amounts of American businesses operating in every country in Europe. So it's not just that there are hundreds of thousands of American tourists that are in Europe all the time, but there are hundreds of thousands of Americans that work in these different companies that live all over Europe. This is going to start becoming a problem because European countries are going to lose confidence in the United States on these trade wars. Again, all the talk of tariffs. You know me, I'm not an economist, but you can't cherry pick different European countries that are in the EU. They protect each other. And so I'm just astounded at the hubris and the lack of understanding coming from the American side about dealing with Europe. Now, look, absolutely, the president is correct that we have been on the wrong end of a lot of trade agreements. Countries are operating with surpluses against us. And for sure, most European countries up until now have not been doing enough for their own defense, let alone to contribute to the alliance. These are completely legitimate complaints, and the president's pressure has forced some of them to finally recognize that, yes, they have to do this. The problem is, and this is to the point of your question, is that as they discover that they can and do have capacities to do things, then they become less and less dependent on us, which I think ends up hurting us economically as well as diplomatically in the long run. Even the United States does not have enough industry and capabilities and capacities in our military and intelligence to do everything by ourselves. We need allies. And even though many of them are frustrating, the fact is all of our best and most reliable allies come from Europe as well as Canada and Australia.
In the long term, what does that mean, though, for the U.S. defense industry? It's a massive part of the U.S. economy. And if it's going to be getting less orders, not just from Europe, but globally, but it's also now forever been tainted with a question. But how if the Americans say we can't receive the weapons? Sorry, we're against the tariffs you put on our goods or the export of our products. And as a result, we're going to cut you off from weapons, which you paid for, but we can cut them off when we want to. Doesn't that sort of seem like a very bad place for us to be in at the moment?
It's a terrible place for us to be. And I was at a conference in Berlin the last 2 days, and I heard this over and over. And of course, competitors from other countries that make products that the U.S. also makes, most of them, there's a European version that's pretty doggone good. And so competitors, also from South Korea, by the way, they will make sure that prospective customers will say, you can't depend on the U.S. And so this is a vulnerability now for American industry if nations begin to believe that maybe we are not dependable. So this is going to be a problem, and the administration, I think, is going to start hearing about it from industry executives that employ hundreds of thousands of people in almost every state in the union. I mean, the F-35 itself has parts that come from every state in the union. And when people start losing jobs because suppliers are no longer being asked to provide things because not countries are canceling orders for F-35, just as an example, that's going to have a political impact as well as an economic impact for us. And then, frankly, our security. I mean, part of the benefit of everybody or most nations having a lot of U.S. capability is interoperability. And when you start losing that, then it weakens our alliances as well. And of course, our allies out in the Pacific are watching this too. I mean, they're not immune to it, even though the U.S. we're turning to the Indo-Pacific region. Those countries out there are very vulnerable, and they see and they begin to question whether or not we are reliable.
For Americans back home, what would it look like, do you think, the sorts of reforms that might be coming to the DoD? How is that going to change what's going on in America or change the way that our military is staffed or situated? And do you think they'll have an implications for our national security as a whole?
So the administration has been signaling for a long time, to include back during the political campaign before the election, that they intended to focus on the Indo-Pacific region, which is, entirely their prerogative. I mean, President Obama said that we need to pivot to the Pacific. So this is not a new thing, and nobody should be surprised that this administration intends to prioritize the Indo-Pacific region and dealing with China. Um, what's difficult for me to fully ascertain is how much strategic analysis has been done that would lead to the conclusions that we're starting to hear about. Now, these are only proposals so far, so I want to make sure that that's clear. But the kind of proposals we've heard in the last several days, keeping in mind that the administration has only been in office 2 months, and most of the positions inside the Pentagon are not filled, and they've sacked the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the chief of naval operations. And I think there's probably more cuts like that at the top level still to come. But yet, we're starting to hear significant changes to the headquarters structure and other assets that are in Europe, for example. Now, everybody over in Europe assumed that there would be cuts. And I'm old enough to have gone through lots of this ups and downs of troop strength of the Army in particular in Europe. Here's what I think is going to happen. I think we're going to see, first of all, the Army overall is probably going to go down. The regular Army has about 490,000, 495,000. That's the regular Army, not Guard and Reserve. The regular Army is probably going to be cut by well over 100,000 troops, because when you want money, the way you do it is by cutting manpower. And the Army typically obviously has the most manpower, and so will be the big bill payer. That's Army total. I think in Europe, what we're going to see is a combining of headquarters. U.S. European Command and U.S. Africa Command are probably going to be combined into one headquarters, which briefs well on paper, but when you lose, there's a reason the AFRICOM was created back in 2007 during the Bush administration, because we have so many issues and concerns about Africa that you needed a headquarters that was focused on it and that could work with our European allies who were dealing with Africa as well. So now this potentially is going to be absorbed back into U.S. European Command, and we'll be back to where we were without having proper focus on security issues in Africa. The second thing I think that's going to happen in Europe, we've heard a lot of reports that the United States plans to give up the position of Supreme Allied Commander Europe, SACEUR, which has been a U.S. position in NATO since Eisenhower, when NATO was first formed. Now, who knows? Maybe that's a good idea, but I don't know where the strategic review, the strategic analysis would tell us we need to get rid of that position, let somebody, the French or the Brits or somebody else have it. I don't know how this advances America's interests to give up that position. And by the way, this is a pretty complicated thing, because you have nuclear deterrence as a part of this. There's a reason you've had Americans in the chain of command always. And you have other American four-stars. You have an admiral in Naples who wears 3 different hats, including a NATO position of Joint Force Command Naples, as well as U.S. Navy Europe and U.S. Navy Africa. And then you've got the Air Force 4-star in Ramstein, who wears 3 hats, including, not only is he U.S. Air Force Europe and U.S. Air Force Africa, he's also the NATO Air Command. So this is a complicated thing. It's not just, giving up one position. So this will have to be sorted out. And of course, with the NATO summit coming up in June, you can't ignore it. So they'll have to do a lot of work quick to explain, how does the alliance adjust to this if this is what's going to happen. Finally, U.S. Troop strength in Europe. Right now, there are about 100,000 Americans that are in Europe, military, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, about 100,000. Of that 100,000, only 60,000 are what you would say are permanently assigned in Europe. The other 40,000 are rotational forces, Guard, Reserve, regular Army. All the tanks, all the armor, everything, all of our engineers and logistics are rotational forces. So this is a little bit tedious, but I have to explain it so that our viewers will understand what's coming. And I think most of this is going to happen this year, which is a pretty dramatic cut. You had what was called the Ukraine supplemental, which is money on top of the budget that was paying for aid to Ukraine. That just expired. And so two of the brigades, a brigade is about 4,000 troops, the heavy brigades with tanks and Bradleys, et cetera, was being paid for by that supplemental. Supplemental's over. The government can't pay for these things out of the existing budget. So that's going to be the first thing that gets cut. So that's two brigades now, real combat power, that will be leaving, my assessment. The second thing is what is called the EDI, European Defense Initiative, which is a fund that was passed by the Congress back in 2016. And that's how we've been paying for rotational forces since then. That's probably going to be cut by this administration. I don't know this for a fact, but that's what I believe is happening. That means all of the rotational forces, all of the armor, all of the real deterrent forces are going to be gone. And then the third part is the baseline force that's paid for by regular budget. And I think the administration is going to come after, they have to. I mean, to get rid of almost 140,000 army, they would have to come after the assigned forces in Europe as well. All of these are the prerogative of the administration. I just don't know what strategic analysis they've done that would lead to the conclusions other than they're looking for money.
Sure. So let me ask you just a couple last questions. If the US does go through these reforms, which you're anticipating, what would that mean for the risk that now occur in Europe? I mean, Russia at this point, as just a few days ago, news came out, according to US analysis, intelligence analysis, Vladimir Putin has not given up on his objectives of taking Ukraine and subduing it. So if he's going to go forward with that, Americans are no longer in Europe. What's that mean for European security? And what's it mean for US national security?
Well, first of all, I think it is important that through all these negotiations, and the president keeps talking about, oh, I had a wonderful phone call, very productive. Mr. Witkoff says this, Secretary Rubio says this. The Russians have not backed away from not one of their objectives, nothing. And they clearly don't feel any pressure from the U.S. to back away from that. And the lack of respect that they have for the United States was made very clear yesterday with this famous phone call where the president of the United States had to wait an hour for Putin to finish something on stage. And then they launched an attack against Ukrainian energy infrastructure within an hour of the agreement that will stop attacking. So, it's so obvious. I mean, Ray Charles could see that they have zero respect for the United States and this administration right now. But having said that, Ukrainians are not going to stop fighting because they know what happens when they stop fighting. So that's not going to happen unless by some miracle there was an agreement that was made that was acceptable to Ukrainians that would assure their sovereignty and their long-term security. I don't see a shred that that's what's in the offing in these current talks. But Europe also, Germany just yesterday has passed a major piece of legislation that will finally allow them to spend money on defense like they should. Now, that's not going to happen next week, but that is a positive step. UK and France both are talking openly about what they're going to do to help Ukraine. Other countries in Europe, as well as the EU as a whole, are all doing things because they see the threat finally from Russia that our Eastern European allies have been talking about and warning about for years. So I think that if the European leadership does really muster the political will that they should, the economic and industrial advantages of Europe over Russia are enormous. I mean, it's huge. And so if they can just muster the political will to use that and make some changes inside their own country. In Germany, for example, they finally are talking about allowing universities to support research and development for defense purposes. That's been like a no-go since the 60s. This will accelerate things. Or if you can change laws that allow companies to make things without having a direct order from the government, that would allow companies in Germany and other European countries to lean forward and build capacity in anticipation of a requirement. So there's a lot that can and will be done pretty quick.
When you say pretty quick, how long would it take Europe to build up to be able to be self-reliant and no longer reliant on the United States? Are we talking a matter of 5 years,
Well,
10 years, 20?
it depends on political will, obviously, but also some things could improve immediately, whereas others will take years. I mean, it's hard to imagine that Europe could replace American intelligence completely, given the satellites and all of that. But again, as we talked about, satellites are not the only means of collecting intelligence. So there will be, um, it will be a while before they have that. But of course, I hope that the United States won't just completely pull all that out because we get more intelligence from our allies. It's not an American satellite that solves all the problems. We have very good productive intelligence sharing arrangements, not just Five Eyes with the Brits and Canada and Australia and New Zealand, but also bilateral with Germany, with Poland, with other countries that are important for us that are not just about Ukraine or Russia. And so I I don't see that being pulled out completely. The nuclear deterrent, of course, when you start counting up warheads, Europe is several thousand less than what Russia has. But you don't have to match numbers of warheads to have an effective nuclear deterrent. It has to be credible. The Russians have to believe that UK would, in fact, use a nuclear weapon or that France would use a nuclear weapon. Of course, it's not that simple. UK and US are intertwined somewhat. The French have maintained total sovereignty over their nuclear force, but it's not so big. But now you hear conversations between Germany, France, Germany, UK, Poland, other countries in Europe are starting to talk about, maybe we need our own, or we need to somehow work more closely with the French and the Brits in recognition that they need a nuclear deterrent. So these kind of things will take a while. Artillery ammunition could improve tomorrow. I mean, a large percentage of what Europe already makes goes to customers in Africa and the Middle East. So this is where a government could say to a vendor in its country, we will protect you from liability, but we want that ammunition that was going to Uganda or UAE, that needs to go to Ukraine. And we will figure out a way to do that. A decision to use these frozen Russian assets, that could happen very quickly. So there are things I think that could happen soon to increase what is provided to Ukraine as well as to build their own capability. But just like the United States cannot rapidly increase production of Gimlers or Patriot, European countries will be in the same boat. These are complex things. They're not making hammers.
Absolutely. That was very interesting. Thank you, sir, for your time, and thank you for your service.
Jason, thank you. And I always enjoy your program. I love your format, and I know you've got a huge audience, so I appreciate every opportunity you give me.
Thank you, sir.